read them off to Mike as well. You can ask them directly when Mike has questions. Mike, you have 40 minutes to educate us.
Mike said go. Great. Thank you, Ben. That was great. And thanks, everybody, for coming this afternoon. I know it's the very end of a very long day, and you're all tired, and you don't want to go see Rick Mercer, and I'm not nearly as funny as Rick Mercer. So thanks for hanging in there. I really appreciate it. What I want to do is talk about some research that I did last year, actually, as part of a graduate program I'm involved in. And I was interested in looking at equity issues in higher education. And so I thought, well, let's look at CIOs and let's look at women in CIO positions. What are the issues around that? What are the barriers? What are the opportunities? How do women feel about those roles that they're in or they aspire to? So I did some work around looking at that from a number of perspectives. So I looked at the research literature. We'll talk a little bit about that. I looked at the whole career pipeline. So how did that influence how women moved into these positions or not? But probably most importantly, what I did is I interviewed a number of women who either had been CIOs, were CIOs, or aspired to be CIOs. And so I'll read you back that analysis of those interviews, and you'll get a sense of how people actually think about their career and what occurred and what didn't occur in their career, what they saw as advantageous or some sort of barrier. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about, well, what can we do about this? What are the sort of opportunities? What are the barriers? What are the challenges that maybe we could take away from either an institutional point of view or perhaps a personal or even an association point of view. So we'll go in a couple of different areas. And hopefully we'll have lots of time to have questions and answers as well. So this is what I want to do, talk a little bit about the data, talk about the pipeline, some of the challenges around the career pipeline for women who aspire or are CIOs, and most importantly, talk about voices from the field. I'll read those sections from those interviews and talk a little bit about that. And then we'll think about next steps, and that's probably where we can have a bit more of a dialogue. I've got some thoughts about this. You probably have lots of thoughts as well on where we can go. The reason I got interested in this was really from the much larger perspective of simply diversity, that we need to ensure that all our organizations, whether they're IT or any part of higher education, really have diversity of voices and skills and backgrounds and all what that brings to the table. So my interest was very much about diversity, and then specifically looking at the role of women in CIO positions as one aspect of that. So that was a specific, I guess, instance of that diversity issue that I was keen on looking at. So let's look at some of the data. The data is from a variety of sources here, but it gives you a sense of, I guess, where women are within these roles. And if you look at the EDUCAUSE members right now, women are just over 21% of the CIOs in the EDUCAUSE membership. And that's been growing, but not quickly. That's been actually pretty static for about the last 2 or 3 years. It's a little worse when you look at actually the international arena. Harvey Nash does a every 2-year survey of CIOs, and in the last 2 years, the last 2 surveys, there's actually a decline in the number of women who are CIOs responding to that survey, and only 7% of the survey respondents were women at all. So we're really seeing a bit of a change maybe in the international arena. When you look at Canada, and this is data from a year ago, so I haven't updated it from for now, but a year ago, 10 of the 51 members of CUCCIO, CIOs, were women CIOs. So again, a percentage that goes up and down, but has been really around that number for a while. So again, what we're looking at is a population that, in terms of participation, in terms of access to these positions, which is still very much challenged. These are not roles that have the kind of diversity and the kind of participation that we would expect. Now, there's a few reasons for that, I think, and you all know, in terms of career paths and career pipelines for women in technology roles to begin with. So one of the things that I wanted to look at was, what about that pipeline? What does it look like? Where are the people who are moving into these more senior roles within IT, and what's their experience? Because we know when we look at career paths that all along that path, there are either encouragements or barriers to achieving these much more senior jobs. So how does it play out? And what does it look like? And there's lots of good news. There's lots of good stories about how this is supported. But unfortunately, we're going to start with the bad news. This, by the way, is a great book. If you want a great book about managing technical people, Leading Geeks is terrible title, wonderful book, very good at sort of analyzing what it takes to work with a very creative technical group. But one of the things that Paul Glenn says in this is geekdom knows no gender boundaries. And I'm here to tell you that I disagree with this, and here's why. Some stories from really only last year and this year that kind of tell you why there are some pretty significant issues with promoting and advancing women in our profession, and particularly into those most senior ranks. Issues which are startling, for me at least, given where we think we are in that journey. And we'll start with DEF CON. DEF CON, some of you may know, is probably the premier hacker conference. This is the place you go to really work with your peers around this kind of tech. And hacker in not the black hat sense of the way, but hacker in the sense of really being very creative and interested in this sort of aspect of IT security. And so this is really the place to be if you want to be involved in this kind of an arena. In the 2012 conference, a number of women participants were sexually abused and indeed sexually assaulted by other participants during the conference. And the reaction from the organizers was this: women shouldn't go to DEF CON if they don't like it. Nadia Aurora, who is the founder of the IDA project, the IDA initiative, it's a really great project in the US, said this about that whole experience. When you say women shouldn't go to DEF CON if they don't like it, are you saying that women shouldn't have all the opportunities that come with attending DEF CON? Jobs, education, networking, book contracts, speaking opportunities, or else should be willing to undergo sexual harassment and assault to get access to it? 2012. 2013, Adria Richards, who's a developer for SendGrid, she's a UX developer, was in the audience and overheard these sexual innuendo comments from two of the people who were in the audience with her. And she actually took a picture of them, you can see them right there, and tweeted it out to the audience. So this was at PyCon, the Python Developers Conference. So she tweeted out, hey, you shouldn't be really talking about forking and big dongles and all that sort of stuff in this kind of a conference, this kind of a meeting. And so almost immediately there was a huge set of attacks on Twitter, mostly against those two guys, but a little bit against Adria as well. And so Playhaven, these two guys worked for Playhaven, fired the two developers. They decided this was not appropriate conduct for their staff to do that, so they fired the two guys. More vicious attacks on Twitter, this time very specifically against Adria. SendGrid fires her. This took about 3 days. This is Sarah Ponder. Sarah is a UX designer in the UK, quite well known, has done lots of speaking engagements, she's at conferences, done lots of consulting, particularly in the UK, and stopped doing that work about a year ago because the back channel was just tearing her apart. Huge vitriolic comments about her, about what she was saying, about what she was trying to do, her appearance, to the point where she just gave up. She said, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to talk about my field. I'm not going to go to these conferences. And said this: there are many questions around why there aren't more females speaking in this industry. I can tell you why. They are scared. So again, 2013. This is recent news. So what I tried to do was talk to some CIOs, talk to some women who either had been a CIO or currently were one or aspired to be one, and just ask them about their career path. Ask them about what happened to them or what was happening to them. And that formed a kind of a sense of voices from the field. And I'm going to do a terrible thing, which I hate it when other presenters do that. I'm going to read parts of this because I really want to make sure I get the words correct, I get the conversation in place. So forgive me for doing this, but I'm going to...
There's a room light behind you if you want to use a mic.
If I do that, what happens?
This
I can see, woohoo!
Too late, but there's actually a podium on it too.
Is that okay? This is okay. This is but a concept. I can do it. Hi. Okay, so I'm going to read. So forgive me for being a terrible presenter and doing this. So I interviewed really 4 people, specifically from specific background, and because of confidentiality reasons, they were quite frank with me. I'm going to refer to them this way. I'm going to refer to them as the former CIO, someone who had been a CIO, no longer is, a current CIO, someone obviously in the position right now, and someone who wants to be a CIO, who I'll call an aspiring CIO. I also interviewed Lori McMullen, the Executive Director of CUCCIO, and I'll come back to that at the end when we talk about her reactions and her comments as well. So you'll see me identifying these people in those sort of terms. So in terms of the interviews, a number of common themes and experiences emerged from these interviews. In terms of the personal characteristics that enabled these women to be successful in their career, all mentioned relationship building and persistence. The aspiring CIO acknowledged that she, quote, worked her ass off, unquote, in order to be seen as a capable manager, noting that, quote, you don't let your guard down, unquote, lest you be viewed by your peers or your supervisor as lacking credibility. The former CIO echoed this and noted her expressed desire to take on bigger challenges and to seek out development opportunities. That desire to seek out development opportunities made her, quote, a challenge for my supervisors, unquote. The current CIO agreed with these sentiments and suggested that making lateral moves was beneficial for longer-term rewards. She acknowledged that her ability to welcome change was important. Quote, I have never been afraid of changing jobs or accepting challenging projects. Words like aggressive, persistent, continuous education, and outspoken were common in their answers. And while none of them actually used the term, I think most saw themselves as pioneers. The importance of mentoring and the presence of role models was mentioned in all the interviews. Aspiring CIO expressed regret that she didn't have a mentor earlier on in her career. Former CIO noted that she didn't actually seek out a mentor. Instead, senior women administrators actually sought her out and reached out to her because I was a woman. The mentors recognized the need to provide help, even though the individual didn't herself recognize that. Role models were also critical. Most critical was to see women in senior administrative roles, not necessarily IT roles, but some other senior administrative role within their organization. Current CIO noted that these individuals were motivating, even if they were not mentors or even personally known to them. Their example was validation that it was possible to achieve these positions. There was tension amongst those interviews about not wanting to acknowledge the systemic barriers or blatant stereotypes that they encountered. And I wondered if this was denial. All indicated that such challenges existed, but all indicated that they were personally not negatively affected by them during their career development or progress. However, former CIO was clear about the persistence of inequities. Quote, it is out there, but I don't like to be preoccupied with it, unquote. All those interviewed reported that they had not altered their leadership style to conform to a male-dominated workplace and a predominantly masculine culture. And yet some of their experiences suggest otherwise, at least to a certain extent. For example, former CIO recounted a meeting where her frustration level at this discussion around a particular operational issue became overwhelming. Because she felt she was going to burst into tears, as a result of frustration, she decided to leave the meeting room. She reflected later on what this said to her male colleagues. Was crying a sign of female weakness? Did this undermine her current and future credibility with her male colleagues? Or would she be seen as playing the quote-unquote female card in order to get some sympathy and perhaps some concessions? Former CIO was advised by another senior women administrator to ratchet back your passion because it demonstrated a female trait that would not serve her well in the organization's culture. Similarly, aspiring CIO identified herself in a positive manner as an emotional person, but wondered if that would cause her to be viewed as weak or less capable. This second guessing of their actions and reactions was a theme throughout all the interviews. The women were behaving and engaging in ways authentic to their personalities and their leadership styles, and yet they were concerned that these responses perpetuated a female stereotype that would negatively impact their career path. The women commented about whether they reflected a female persona, or simply their own persona. Aspiring CIO wondered if it was our own game we play with ourselves by regularly questioning their own actions, their own motivations, and how they were viewed by others. These mind games were a predominant topic in most of the interviews. Aspiring CIO wondered if she stereotypes herself. The changing nature of the CIO role was acknowledged by all the women. Former CIO indicated that this has opened up opportunities for women because the focus is now less technical and more strategic. However, aspiring CIO and former CIO noted that while the role has changed, many of the search committees and senior administrators have not fully understood this shift. As a result, the traditional expectation of a technical expert, a head of IT, persists. Aspiring CIO felt that the changed role and expectations of the CIO needed to be better communicated to those entrusted with hiring into these positions. Not having this informed perspective was undermining women seeking out these roles. Concern, even insecurity about a lack of a technical or IT background was expressed by some of the women. And this was noted in an EDUCAUSE survey of a few years ago, that this concern was prominent despite the fact that these women knew that the role was no longer a technical one, nor required an extensive technical background. Both the aspiring CIO and the former CIO came from non-technical backgrounds. One had a BA in English literature, another a BCom in marketing, and clearly they indicated that their employer, quote, took a chance on them, unquote, allowing them to get into an initial position in information technology. The current CIO actually has a humanities background, but also a graduate degree in computer science. The most significant shift appears to be not in the equity of opportunity for women arising from a more inclusive workplace, but rather the emerging redefinition of the role of the CIO and other IT positions. And that redefinition diminishes the technical focus of the position. It may well be that women are becoming CIOs in part because the qualifications for that CIO role has changed. Many of the questions repeatedly focused in the interviews on the differences between men and women in terms of their leadership styles, career advancement, and opportunities for development. When pressed to draw out these issues, many of the women expressed frustration, even a weariness, to put all this behind them and to move on. A common theme was to have women acknowledged solely on the basis of their skills and abilities and not from their perspective of them as women. All the women interviewed mentioned their family situation and how this affected their career path. Whether they had children or not, whether their partner was able to stay home with the family, and whether they were able or willing to move to seek advancement were clearly critical components of their career choices. The former CIO said that unlike many, she had one job, not two, because of a stay-at-home partner. All acknowledged that there was an assumption by others that they had given up something in order to take on the roles, and that they were taking on the roles that they were in, although they themselves didn't believe that. The research literature consistently highlights the need for better supervision and better supervisors to respond to the different expectations and challenges of women moving through their careers in information technology and other areas as well. Those interviewed all directly or indirectly supported this. Supervisors were either viewed as singularly critical to them moving forward. They took a chance on me, they gave me opportunities, they were stimulating and supportive, or specifically unhelpful. No feedback, I was a challenge, I had to move on. While feedback and career development are expectations of men as well as women, it was clear from the literature in these interviews that women expected a different kind of support from their supervisors. Now, when asked if being a woman was actually an advantage in their career path, for example, as a result of employment equity programs or special initiatives, all said no. Since all these women had careers at a time when a focus on equity issues for women was prominent, especially in higher education, I wondered what this said. Were the programs implemented to support and advance women ineffective? Were they simply not available to these women? Or did they not want to acknowledge the differences that these programs actually did make, preferring to see their success as a result of their own abilities and performance? The presence or absence of women role models in leadership positions or in IT positions generally was important to all the interviewees. Most of them were concerned about starting an old girls network to offset the existing old boys network. And all reinforced the need for networking, and in certain cases, the need for specific networking with women. They want the network to allow them to enhance their abilities, but they don't want the network to bestow preferential treatment. While CUCCIO was viewed as a venue for this, SWAC, which is the Senior Women's Academic Administrators of Canada. People know that organization, Senior Women Academic Administrators of Canada? Yeah. SWAC was seen as either unknown by these folks or viewed with some concern. SWAC was established to encourage, develop, and support women in leadership roles in higher education. It was also seen as problematic by these women as really reinforcing distinctions rather than advancing inclusivity. Now, much has been written about the rise of female leadership styles as an advantageous thing in the changing workplace and the business environment. And when trying to pursue this with the women, they resisted seeing their leadership style as gendered. There was a strong desire to be successful based on their own skills and expertise, and not as a result of special treatment or preferential programs, and certainly not because the bar was set lower for them. So when I talked to these women, I thought, okay, now let's move and talk to Lori McMullen, the Executive Director of CUCCIO, about how CUCCIO relates to this and how she saw this advancing. Now, Lori is also a former CIO for the province of New Brunswick, as well as the University of New Brunswick. So I wanted to see how Lori connected to this, and she agreed that her comments could be made public. So Lori acknowledged that the increase in women, Lori acknowledged the increase in women CIOs, but noted perhaps more importantly that women are typically the most active participants from member institutions in CUCCIO, whether they're the CIO or a designated representative or simply a member of some of the CUCCIO committees. Women apparently, more so than men at least, take advantage of CUCCIO as a networking opportunity to broaden their expertise and to make connections to advance their careers. Now, there's a professional development program being undertaken by CUCCIO, and Lori indicated that those programs really need to respond to all the members and all IT staff. She really sees the concerns of women being incorporated into this in a much more holistic way. The most significant challenge, according to Lori, is not with existing women in IT and IT leadership roles, but with young women in grade 9 or earlier who need to see IT and technical roles, technical careers as exciting, desirable, and free from negative consequences. To that end, CUCCIO may wish to sponsor events or programs which bring together CIOs and technical staff in higher education with young women at the very earliest stages of their career choices. With this greater participation of women in all aspects of organizational, with this greater participation of women in all aspects of organizational change within CUCCIO, Lori talked about how the leadership within CUCCIO has been primarily male-dominated. And for the first time, actually, last year, Ghislaine Roguette from McGill was the first woman who was the president of CUCCIO. Lori thinks this will have an impact on the organization, and responses will be different in some fashion. However, much like the current CIO, the former CIO, and the aspiring CIO, Lori wants to transition to a situation where women are acknowledged, promoted, and celebrated based on their expertise and accomplishments, and not held back by adverse cultures, negative stereotypes, and explicit discrimination. If there was a single common theme among all 4 interviews, it was that all are weary of having to talk about and deal with women as disadvantaged in the IT workplace. All would like to put this behind them, to not have to be concerned about inequity, and to not have to put energy and focus into such distractions. And yet all acknowledge that barriers and obstacles still exist for women, and that work must be done to eradicate those concerns. So those 4 women talked about experiences which turned out to be kind of similar in lots of different dimensions. And it was clear that there were opportunities as well as barriers and challenges. So one of the things that I looked at was a number of organizational models around how you approach diversity issues and how you approach equity issues. And Susan Sturm has a particularly useful piece which she calls the architecture of inclusion, and identifies 3 areas where these sorts of things can play out. And she talks about it in terms of organizational citizenship. In other words, organizations thinking about what it means to be a citizen within their culture, within their organization, and how that gets promoted. But also this idea of organizational catalysts, so events or some sort of change that can occur in an organization that would cause a different culture to emerge or different opportunities to happen. And then she talks about organizational intermediaries, institutional intermediaries. And this will be something like CUCCIO or another organization that would actually provide another means to promote, encourage, and support women in that movement. So thinking about that, I was thinking about what things could change, what actions could be taken. And this is certainly where I want to get some of your comments as well. But clearly, number 1 from the research literature and number 1 from the comments from the women that I interviewed was enhance the skills of supervisors. That role was critical in terms of career path, in terms of encouraging development, and that the less skilled that supervisor was, the more difficult it was for women to move through those organizational paths. True for men as well. So this is really something that could strengthen the career development of all folks. Mentoring programs, and I'll come back to mentoring programs in a minute because there's some particularly interesting research on this, but mentoring programs are tremendously important and need to be encouraged in a variety of different ways. In-house, in-service training was clearly useful, and different kinds of work opportunities, flexible work opportunities, and even flexible workplaces were good. And maybe even as significant as this is the idea of credible, non-hierarchical career paths. That we really want to get away from that hierarchical food chain model anyway, and that there are opportunities to see leadership evolve that are not necessarily focused around moving through an organizational food chain of some sort. The mentoring piece was really interesting. This is some data from a study in 2009, which, oh boy, it barely shows up. Oh, I know, I can show it up. Hold on. Which is back in the dark. Better. Okay, it's a bit better. So this is the result. The results from a question, which is who's helping you prepare you to become a CIO? So who's helping you move through that career path? And I want to focus on 2 things here, which are really dramatic. The answer of no one is really interesting because the men, 43% of the men said nobody is helping them become a better CIO. And look at when it says my CIO. 51% of the women said my CIO is helping me become better in my job and moving me forward. This is really interesting data in terms of what obviously men and women expect differently from a mentoring relationship or want from a mentoring relationship. But there's also something else behind the data which is interesting. These men who clearly don't see themselves being helped probably aren't going to move into senior positions and help other people either. So there's a kind of a relationship here where I didn't need that sort of help, I'm not going to provide that to somebody else as well. And yet women clearly in this from this research need or expect or want that kind of assistance from their supervisor or certainly from their CIO in this particular case. So mentoring is a big difference for men and women and very significant in terms of successful career paths. So there's some things I think that CUCCIO might do as well that might help with this. Certainly better, different networking events. Bringing communities together different ways would be incredibly important. And one obvious thing would be to bring young women into these meetings in a different way, to show them that these kinds of careers, whether it's at the CIO level or any sort of level within IT, are desirable and advantageous kinds of careers. There may be even a reason here to have a kind of a code of conduct for meetings. Now, I'm not aware of difficulties at a CUCCIO meeting or a candidate meeting, but even just discussing these kinds of issues in terms of codes of conduct raises the issue of how we want to behave as a group and how we want to encourage that kind of behavior within our own institutions. So that might be a good exercise in order to raise those kinds of issues and promote them. SWAC really could do some really useful things because they really have never had women CIOs come and talk to them about those roles, nor talk to them about some sort of an ICT leadership track within their organization. So there's some opportunities there as well. I think clearly there's some opportunities for individuals or some actions individuals can take. And certainly key amongst those is taking charge of your own professional development and career path. There's a lot of what the interviewees said to me was that they had to do that themselves. They had to take charge of that. A wonderful quote here from the current CIO. I have managed my career in professional development myself, often because my bosses were academics and didn't have a clue about what was required. We live in a particular context where a lot of the people we work with really are working in different areas and sort of have different views of the world. And this woman was really clear that she wasn't going to get a lot of help from her boss, her supervisor, and as a result, needed to do all that herself. So seeking out mentors, insisting on those kinds of challenges are all things that are helpful and have been positive for these women as well. And it kind of lands on this book that came out just recently from Sheryl Sandberg. I don't know if anyone has read Lean In. It's hugely popular right now, and it's a little bit, it's a little bit of buzz of the moment. But I think what she ended up saying in that book is actually what the people I interviewed said as well. We hold ourselves back in ways both big and small by lack of self-confidence, by not raising our hands, and by pulling back when we really should be leaning in. And all the women that I interviewed talked about that kind of attitude as something that was helpful to them and really helped them move past some of these barriers that I had identified and they had identified. So as popular as that book is, it really has nailed, I think, a particular seam or theme within these kinds of issues. I should tell you that the whole report that I did, the whole research report I did, is actually posted on my website. If you want the gory details of all this and the research literature, you can just go to www.michaelridley.ca, and it's there. You can read all the bits and pieces. There's more data there in terms of some of the reports that bring into this conclusions and some of this data. But I really wanted to spend the rest of the time with you talking about whether this rings true for you, whether you see this in your workplace, whether the kinds of recommendations and actions that I've talked about are ones that would make a difference, and even better, are there ones you can think of that would be more effective or more useful. So I'd kind of like to turn it over to you folks now and see whether this rings true, whether this isn't your experience, or whether you have some suggestions on where organizations can move forward. The data still suggests that women are not moving into these roles in the ways that they should be in terms of their percentage of participation in this place, in this job category. So, open for questions. Yeah.
I appreciate that a lot of the things that could be done differently are driven by the person themselves. Like, women who want to get those jobs, we need to act differently, lean in, don't lean out, whatever those things are. So you can do a lot for yourself. But I wonder, is that the only thing that we do? I've been in technology since I got out of engineering school. One of 10 women in my class. So, I've been there, done that. But are there not barriers that have nothing to do with what I can do for myself? How do we get rid of those barriers that are not self-imposed in our head, or the fact that there's not enough women? So you didn't seem to find too many of those where it's been, careful to say this, that it's maybe male-driven or environmentally driven. I appreciate we do a lot to ourselves, but are there not a few things out there that are also against us that we can't break down by herself.
So two things, I want to turn this back to the rest of the audience. One of the things we certainly did find was the sort of the masculine culture around IT. And it's when you look at something like DEF CON or some of those conferences where clearly that's coming out in dramatic ways.
Sending more women to DEF CON will not change that.
Right.
So we
Right.
can bombard it, but just more women will be exposed to that.
So yeah, so how do you change that, I guess? I mean, they are thinking now about a code of conduct for DEF CON, whether that's going to do it or not, I don't know. So there's, I guess the distinction I was trying to make is there's some sort of external environments, and then there's the internal ones within our organization. I think some of the external ones are a bit more amplified. Internally, I think it's much more subtle. I would agree. I don't know whether you would agree with that those sort of areas are more subtle.
And do you think those internal ones are enough? And maybe the group could respond.
Yeah.
Would it be enough to do all those things, and would they break the external ones? Or without that, there's just no point? I don't know.
What do people
I would
think?
say if you're in a place where you don't feel that you can move up or advance because you're a woman, leave.
I think there's enough places where you can be a woman and be successful. Yeah, I don't think you have to stay there.
No, I would leave and go somewhere where you felt that you would have the freedom to just be who you are and continue along the path you want to go.
So mobility was a big issue that came up in our conversations, and that's an issue for a lot of women, that they don't feel they're as mobile. They understand totally that, and that's true, I think, of everyone, that being more mobile has an advantage to it, but they felt that sometimes was not an opportunity, not something for them. Yeah.
I think I feel encouraged though, because I think that one of the common threads of these last 2 days of different talks has been that there's new opportunities within IT for communications, conversation, all of the things that socially and stereotypically women are strong with. And I think, I mean, I agree, you have to be at the right place at the right time, and there is a certain amount of initiative, let's say, that a woman has to present, but I still think with business value and with the people component that all entails, I really think it's a good time for women to take the bull by the horns and to grab those opportunities and excel.
Yep, sorry.
I have a question that comment as well. In your research, at the University of Alberta, we have a program called WISES, which stands for Women in Scholarship, Engineering, Science, and Technology. And what this basically is a summer work program for grade 11 students to be exposed to science. And so for about 8 years prior to me getting my current role, I always hired a grade 11 girl, and I gave her a very interesting computing science research project to do. And I didn't follow up with them afterwards to see what career path they made. And all except one went into other fields other than computer science, or information technology. The one who did go into computer science did not go to the University of Alberta.
So it's a very successful program. Congratulations on that.
I was a complete failure. But I have always tried to wonder, well, what happened? Because I tried to mentor them the best I could. I was always encouraging and supportive to them. Yeah. But I don't understand what it was at that level, even back in grade 11, that caused them to go into other fields. Like they went to business, agriculture, nursing, anything but IT.
And there are a lot of those kinds of programs around. One of the ones I really like, if you want to take a look at a really interesting one, it's called IT Girl. IT Girl from Syracuse University. And they do this sort of thing, but they do it over weekends, and they bring in, I think they're sort of grade 9, 10 sort of age. And they've been tracking those girls now, I guess, for a number of years to see where they go. And their success rate's been better than yours.
My question is, including my total failure rate, can you give me statistics as to say for our WISES program, as to how many of the girls who were exposed in computing science went on to actual IT careers?
Yeah.
I certainly contributed to failure.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, we'll come back to that. If you have a question.
Yeah, well, I may have an answer, well, not an answer, but I was in high school, I was excellent at math and English. And then, but when it came to it, like I took all the math classes I could, but I didn't see a career for me in that. And I chose English and communications because I saw people in that and I thought, oh, this is more exciting. So I think the mentoring, and I think also, like I think the web is great because like I ended up kind of in IT via the English route. But it's because I saw a place in this area. My comment I was going to have before on the mentoring I found easy. I found interesting because I kind of wonder if women feel that we need more validation. So that's why we need to be mentored. Like it needs to be almost more formalized. I have to do a certain path, and then once I've done a certain path, then I just kind of throw that out there as a topic.
Yeah, I also wonder whether it's because, in a sense, you're in a disadvantaged position anyway to begin with in this, that you really just need that extra reinforcement and encouragement. It's sort of a natural kind of thing. I think it just.
But I don't feel disadvantaged. I just feel like I would want to learn more.
Right.
And how do I learn more?
Right.
So,
Yeah,
one question and a comment is, I'm intrigued by your suggestion that CUCCIO, because that's the organization that you get to represent, the basis of suggesting that we need to have a code of conduct, is that just a best practice, or is there specific reasons why you would have went there? Because I mean, I participated for about 2 years in those meetings, and I'm not sure I can relate to that suggestion, so I'm intrigued by it.
Yeah, the reason I mention is maybe less because we need something for these meetings or that there's some sort of deficiency there, but more that having those kinds of conversations amongst ourselves goes back home with us. And we start talking about those kinds of issues as being organizational issues more generally. So if we don't talk about those kinds of questions or behaviors or what has happened in other places, then it isn't a conversation we have all the time. So it was more like a kind of a starter conversation we could have here, and then it could end up going back to our organizations, and where probably it's more important in some respects. I mean, I don't know how many people go home and talk about values like this and concerns like this in their own workplace, but it's prevalent. It's an issue with all of us. That was really the rationale for that.
Yeah, okay, that provide a better background for it. And my other comment related to sort of the internal stuff, those 3 recommendations really take the gender out of it, because they're really just good HR practices, regardless of what the gender is, which is encouraging to see.
Totally.
Because I think probably heard in your interviews, and maybe some comments here, is we don't gender. I push away as soon as gender becomes part of the conversation, because it's almost like an excuse.
And yet, as the interview showed, all the interviews said exactly the same thing, and then proceeded to tell me stories where that was a problem. And so it's a conflict, and you folks live probably that conflict a little bit in terms of that. So it's there, whether, how we acknowledge it, how we confront it is maybe the bigger issue. I want to go back to the supervisor thing 1 minute ago. That's absolutely true, but all the literature talks about improving supervision as being the single best thing you can do. In terms of career development, recognizing different needs for different people, no matter what, whether it's women or men or whatever other characteristic they might have, all that is the single best thing that an organization can do. And we don't always do that very well. So there's a plus that we really could make a significant difference.
I'm going to interrupt.
This side of the table has no questions apparently.
I'm going to interrupt for a moment. This is actually a novel experience for me. Normally, I'm kind of like the soup Nazi, only about timers. In this particular case, our next session is 5 p.m., and that's optional off. And then we have our 6:30 dinner and at the Rick Mercer. But I'm pretty sure, knowing Mike, that he wouldn't mind going past the allocated time for this session.
No worries.
So it's officially over now, but I think Mike will stay and take a few more questions. Is that a fair comment?
Yep, that's perfect, Dan. Thanks. And